Hey there, Mr. Redder here. Welcome back to another episode of Reddit Podcast Stories. Our first story we'll be reading today, Part 2 of Parents Trying to Take My House for My Brother. They broke my locks to move in while I wasn't home. After that, the time the company lawyers told me to contact law enforcement. And after that, have me sign a weird contract or I fail? Okay. Now for every thumbs up this video gets, one Karen Central Heat goes out. Pah! You think that will affect me? My heart is already ice cold, Reddit boy. So please smash that like button and subscribe and turn on notifications for new stories from Reddit every single day. Part 2 of Parents Trying to Take My House for My Brother. They broke my locks to move in while I wasn't home. Some parents can't explain why they make choices like child favoritism. So all they can do is try and stand by the kid that they backed, which is exactly what my parents tried to do. And I've practically destroyed their lives for it. Not in the legal sense, but more so an emotional one. So after I kicked my parents and brother and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and I told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago and I put my own profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that this was the first thing my family would do when they got home and they'd try to twist the event to make me the villain. And I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them, and I had video evidence to back up my story about what they had done. No, I don't plan on showing the video here, so don't ask. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been all set to write their own posts, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were. So what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular that called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me that I was a horrible brother and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then in her most sickly sweet tone asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to buzz off and to never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I can't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he treated me like crap for years and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents and he's a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave or I'd be calling police ASAP. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously, because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family there moving stuff in. He just waved to me with a grin on his face when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop. But sister-in-law smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. And then in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I seethed with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face. So I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, and that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. And she cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "Forget Dan. It's my darn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then when we went to my front door, I saw that they had changed the lock, and the old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they used was laying right next to it, with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more stupid leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown on all of the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home, because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie, one way or another. So Dan and sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they had somehow outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. And I don't think going to jail or court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call the authorities too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all of that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the darn camper so that they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house instead to himself. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now or I'll press charges. I shouted about how they had drilled out my front door lock to break in, the lease papers being obvious fakes. They badly forged my signature, and I have recorded video of sister-in-law attacking me. Those are felonies, and I could really affect their lives with it if I wanted to. And if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they have one chance to just get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do this for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to sister-in-law and spoke to her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. Sister-in-law instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell her to pick them up, or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan starts telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he won't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear, I think they had practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he could possibly make and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and sister-in-law turned the crying up to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, like when we were kids. Dan started going off on me until the cops told him to cool it or he'd be in cuffs, regardless of if I wanted to press charges or not. He sucked in his lips and looked like a mix of afraid and supremely upset. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left, and they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door, though I got another lock the next day anyway, because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled, then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and to never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then in an overly sarcastically way, I said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys, where I always get treated like crap by you all anyway, because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you, and just get over it." My parents were floored after I said all of that, and the cops were all looking pretty judgmental at them as well. I tell you, if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops, because they'll likely not try anything really stupid then. My mother just started crying and walked away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to get me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and sister-in-law was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. Soon enough, they all formed a line, handing out boxes, and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was all taken out pretty quickly. But while doing this, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan several times, each time trying to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around. I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way that they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sister-in-law ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down, then sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. And she just sat looking angry and sad there until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all of the crap that they put me through growing up. And with 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on so many things that happened, and even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet, how they let Dan and sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it free of charge, yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford just to park my camper when they knew I was out of the job. There were more extremely judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that. So I put my parents on the spot one more time and asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve being treated so badly. Because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite kid, since they'd rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like a fish out of water. So I continued ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father's face was red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are, and they knew it. But if I'd called them out on all this stuff in private instead of in public, they'd just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They all got back into their vehicles, and sister-in-law just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans about what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time, and while the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family has sided with me after this incident, and those who haven't simply aren't siding with anybody. No matter how much my parents previously tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore. So any remaining familial support that they had is now gone. Many in the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did. That includes the former flying monkeys. So I guess they finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at next Christmas Eve in my new house. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother and sister-in-law's profiles, surprisingly, and I saw sister-in-law had her fourth baby in early November. They're still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew that I was watching because sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she can still guilt me. And I'm sure it's driving my mother and father up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over the house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. There was supposed to be more, but this post got way too long, so I'll be posting a part 3 later. That time, the company lawyers told me to contact law enforcement. This took place years ago, but still makes me laugh at the sheer stupidity of it all. It starts as all truly great sagas published on the internet begin, when I met a random guy through a friend at a bar in the city. Let's call the guy I met Mark for the purpose of this post. My friend had introduced me to Mark because for a few years leading up to that introduction, I shared an idea I had for a business with anyone who would listen. I was told Mark wanted to start his own business, had worked in the industry, knew a lot about the subject matter required, and thought my idea was good. Mark and I met up for a lunch. We hit it off. He said he'd start the business as the CEO and agreed to me taking a part-time operational role. I agreed to help solely in a part-time operational role because I couldn't afford to quit my day job. I put in 15% of the cash for 5% ownership since Mark was going to put in founder hours, 80 plus hours a week, and agreed to put up 85% of the cash, which was more money than I could afford to risk on a new venture. I worked part-time. I did what I said I would do. I even tried to be of assistance on things I had no experience with. I connected Mark with a fellow I had done business with before. We'll call him Paul. Paul and I got into a dispute ourselves. More on this later. Anyway, let's fast forward a few months, and I got into a dispute with Mark over stationery. Yes, stationery not being to his liking caused him to flip out. This was despite him picking the stationery out. Next up, the contract I got from Mark was not quite what we agreed. The legal work required a few months to get done, and I had expected delays, but when I finally got it, the paperwork didn't represent what I had agreed to own. Not only that, but my investment wasn't being acknowledged under the terms we had committed to when I put the money in. Now, as I said, I wasn't able to risk much money, and I only invested what I could afford to lose, so this wasn't a huge sum of money. I didn't want to make a big deal about it since the amount was small, and he began promising a new contract when the business could pay for the lawyers to make changes. I signed nothing. Then it worsened. Mark and I start to fight anytime we're in a room together. As I think back, it's almost comical how angry he would get in my presence. I have other things to do with my time than squabble over stuff like stationery, so I worked on my areas of the business and hoped things would grow. I stopped in whenever I could and would help out regularly as needed with as little Mark interaction as possible. Paul would intervene sometimes when Mark would get particularly difficult to be around. Anyway, fast forward about 2 years, and Mark can't help but tell everyone who will listen that the business is going well. I have no idea how well things are going because Mark isn't giving me any updates. I get a call around Christmas from Mark. He wishes me a happy holiday, then drops the bomb on me that he wants to terminate my involvement and refund my investment. I decline the investment refund and say I'm happy to no longer work with him. In my head, I think it's kind of hilarious that he thinks this will just end that easily, but I say nothing to that accord to him. Mark and I hang up, with him aggravated about my refusal to take the refund on my investment. Mark then sends me an email that I had resigned. This had no basis in fact, but certainly was creative about what we had just discussed. I correct him immediately in a reply stating that he wanted to no longer work together and that I can see that being the case, but want to discuss my investment. A few days later, Mark demands I come pick up a check for a reimbursement of my investment. I do not come and get it. Next thing you know, the company attorney huffs and puffs and tries to scare me with some strongly worded letter. This is the same idiot attorney who messed up my contract to work on the business and my investment agreement. Let's call this attorney Mr. Cohn for the sake of this story. I send an email response to Mr. Cohn that he messed up. The company seems to be doing well, that I hear rumors about how well, that I want to be on this for the foreseeable future, and I will not take a 1-1 cash for what I put in. The attorney then emails me back, stating in writing that Mark never accepted my electronic transfer into the company account. Instead, Mark has another company he accepted the money into. A company that's different from the name of the recipient on my electronic transfer. A company that would be committing wire fraud to accept the money I sent. On that note, I did some sleuthing online. I found out Mark had been forming one company every month or two. Then there were media reports and documents he let slip and shared drives he forgot I had access to from when we agreed to work together. Mark was too cheap and stupid to pay for tech help, so he was using my shared folders I had created, and I certainly wasn't obligated to turn off the shares if he wanted to work out of them. Those documents showed me Mark had recently raised money in the company I sent the payment to at 200 times the valuation I had bought into it at, and Mark didn't disclose my investment to the new investors. Mark had, however, put me on documents showing my ownership to previous investors. Not on documents I had ever seen before, but documents he had been sending around. When I share my suspicions that Mark is committing wire fraud with Mr. Cohn, I'm told I'm the one breaking the law by knowing anything about the investment documents the company has used. Mr. Cohn tells me that by not picking up my check, I will not be entitled to any money and to contact law enforcement if I think something illegal has happened. He cautions, though, that I'll be the one in trouble. Cue the malicious compliance. I let the different respective members of the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with law enforcement, know what happened to me. I provided them all of the documents I had from the matter. It took about 5 years for this investigation to conclude, for charges to be brought, for a trial to conclude, and for Mark to go to jail. They say government is slow, but they aren't kidding with just how slow. Maybe it was slow because Mark was running a large, tens of millions of dollars large, fraud. Anyway, Mark will be serving time for about 30 felony charges they found uncovering the details of his Ponzi scheme. He will be away for a long time. I never did anything wrong. With the information I was able to provide, Mr. Cohn ended up getting disbarred. There were other things Mr. Cohn did outside of what is shared in this post that I cannot share, or it could help to identify me to the folks involved. The investigators credited me with bringing the wire fraud to their attention. I lost my money in this ordeal, but gained an education, and I got to help bring down a crook. The sheer stupidity of Mark is that he didn't even follow the business plan I had. He just used it as a story to convince investors to give him money. It's a business model that works very, very well. It took a few more years, but I'm now in a position to be pursuing this business full-time with people of high integrity who all work together to ensure each other's success. We expect to have an extremely profitable year in 2023 after proving the business model worked in 2022. Have me sign a weird contract or I fail? Okay. Last semester, I had to take a class from a professor who wasn't bad as being incompetent, but definitely was one of those "I have a new way to teach that I developed" kind of professors. She also gave the vaguest instructions on what she did want in her turned-in work and didn't believe in study guides, as she wanted to encourage reading the material. Honestly, I got more out of the book than her class, and buying the book alone would have been far cheaper. Trying to get direction out of this lady was worse than trying to pull teeth, met with mostly "do your best." On top of this, she apparently handed out a grading contract on the first day to everyone we had to sign in return. I missed this due to being sick, so I didn't get it until later. Said contract basically boiled down to indicating what grade you wanted at the start of the semester. You either met the conditions for that grade or you would fail. So basically, by saying you wanted an A, you either met the qualifications for an A or you could fail, even if you could have gotten a B or a C instead. If you decided to play it safe with saying you wanted a C, even if you exceeded and would normally get a B or an A, you would just get a C. So to cut out a lot of the drama of the semester, 2 things. First being I had surgery at the beginning of the semester. Second is I was working full-time while at school to pay for said school. Both ended up with me missing a lot of work, and normally I would just cut my losses, except I'm very close to my degree and my professor said I could make up the work. Otherwise, I would fail and need to retake the class anyway in the spring. So I decided I had nothing to lose and buckled down with basically getting next to no sleep for weeks. I had over a month and a half at least amount of work and 2 weeks to do it in. Now finally, this is where the malicious compliance comes in. During an exchange where I was emailing my work, she told me I still hadn't done her contract, which at that point, only a few weeks out from finals, I didn't get the point. But she told me either I did the contract or I would fail. She also had let slip that not doing the final would drop you a letter grade, but not fail you. The only exception to her weird contract that wasn't in it, and one I confirmed very deliberately in writing. At this point, I was bone tired and honestly forcing myself to continue working on anything, which may not sound like much, but with my mental health history was Herculean effort. I just wanted the pain to stop and a full night's rest. So I decided if not doing the final just dropped me by a letter grade, then I would just do the work for a B and end up with the grade I thought was fair for how the semester had gone. This meant for even more work, but it also meant I didn't need to worry about a final and could finally just sleep, which I explained as much to the professor when she asked me why I didn't have a final turned in on the last day. That so far has been the last I ever spoke to or seen of her. Imagine my surprise when I actually ended up with a B in her class. Personally, I take this to be her never wanting me in her class again, and I don't know if it makes me a jerk overall. But I do know she apparently has it now that not doing the final is an automatic D. So sorry to anyone who got her after me. Am I the jerk for telling my son he has to go to university, get a job, or get out? My wife and I have 3 kids. They're 17, 15, and 10. My oldest has no intention to do anything after high school, at least none that he's made clear to us. So I gave him the same ultimatum my parents gave me. Either go to university, get a job, or get out. I chose to travel the world for 2 years. I had a lot of sailing experience, and my father had a lot of friends in that community, so I was able to sail around the world earning money and working my butt off. It wasn't a 2-year vacation. My family is well off, and I could have chosen an indolent life, but I knew I would be a disappointment if I chose that. So when I got back, I enrolled in university and eventually went to work for the family business. My wife thinks that I'm being unfair to our poor baby boy by throwing him out into the world. I'm not. We have the money to pay for his university. We have the money for all 3 kids. My middle child will probably end up with a good chunk of it in her pocket. She's on track for an academic as well as a golf scholarship. The 10-year-old is 10, and who knows what he's going to do, but he knows the plan. We have not been secretive about this rule. My wife and I agreed that we would raise productive members of society before we got engaged. Her and my son think I'm being cruel to expect him to fend for himself at 18. I've offered him multiple opportunities to do other things. He has no interest in anything beyond his computer. I'm at a loss. I don't think I'm wrong for expecting an adult to be an adult. My parents have already told him that they will not be giving him any money if he isn't in school or working. My wife is threatening to use her salary to support him. I don't have any say in that. I won't actually kick him out of the house, but I will stop paying his bills and cut off our grocery budget by 20%. If she wants to work so he doesn't have to, then there's nothing I can do about that. It's not fending for oneself when the parent tells the kids, go to university, we pay for it, you stay under our roof, or work, keep your money to yourself, you stay under our roof, or choose to do nothing with your life and you'll have to fend for yourself. Not at all. You don't even give him ultimatums about what to study or what job to take. He could bum around from major to major or from minimum wage job to another while figuring out what he wants to do with his life, with all expenses paid. He's not going to get sudden inspiration on how to spend his adult life by staying home and doing nothing. Not the jerk for actually parenting your kid. Well, what do you think? Is OP a jerk or not? Please let us know. Am I the jerk for refusing a person a plate after they showed up uninvited? Everyone is in their mid to late 20s. My boyfriend and I have been hosting Monday night dinner parties at our apartment for about a year. It's not every week, but most. I have food allergies and it's hard to go out, so this has been a good alternative. About 2 months ago, an old high school friend, Layla, moved to my city with her fiance, Lucas, and I started inviting them to our dinners. Lucas is insufferable. He will never try again his food before adding additional seasoning, which is a pet peeve of mine, but I could get over it if he ate it, but it ends up directly in the trash. He'll add a bunch of salt to an already salted dish, take one bite and then say, "Ew, it's too salty," or dump a ton of red pepper on it and then complain that it's too spicy, etc. It's like he's deliberately ruining his plate so he can complain about it. It's probably petty, but it really gets under my skin. and it bugs my boyfriend too to toss out food that would have been perfectly good without his tampering. I put up with this for 5 dinners, and then I stopped inviting them. I've still texted and met with Layla for coffee, but I haven't extended another dinner invite. They showed up this Monday without an invite right as we were starting dinner. Lucas sat down and started filling a plate before my boyfriend stopped him and told him he wasn't welcome to waste more of our food. It turned into an argument where Lucas insisted he shouldn't be forced to eat things he doesn't like, and I got angry and told him how could he be forced when he wasn't even invited. Voices were raised, and eventually Layla and Lucas left, but the mood was ruined for the night. Everyone who was present agreed with me, but I guess Layla either told our old friend group or posted about it, because I've gotten an odd amount of texts from people I haven't talked to in years calling me a jerk for kicking them out over my bad cooking. It's not bad cooking, so maybe I am. A small update. I received a very enlightening text from an old friend that Layla has kept close with. Apparently, Lucas did not want to move at all, but Layla was offered an amazing opportunity here, so he agreed. According to this friend, Lucas has also sabotaged happy hour with her new coworkers and always, coincidentally, needs her at home whenever she wants to go out with new friends. It seems like he is maybe trying to make her unhappy socially here, so she'll be willing to move back home. I feel a little guilty for not picking up on this sooner, but I'm grateful for the perspective. I plan to reach out to Layla tomorrow and see if we can have a real talk about her situation. Not the jerk. While you don't owe it to them, I think it might have gone over better to have talked to Layla while you were having coffee, to let her know that his behavior is insulting and wasteful, and that you wouldn't be inviting him to any more dinners if he continued. Unless you explicitly told them, you can't assume they knew it was bothering you, as reasonable and understandable as your position is. I'm sorry to hear that this happened, but I hope you have lovely dinner nights moving forward. How nice of you and your boyfriend to host this regularly. Not the jerk. Make sure you respond to everyone telling them that 1. Lucas and Layla showed up unannounced and uninvited to your home for your dinner party. 2. Lucas helped himself to your dinner without asking or being invited to it, and you were not planning on 2 extra guests. Then Lucas got mad at your boyfriend when he was stopped because he was not welcome to it. 3. Lucas has behaved very rudely the first and only 5 times he's been properly invited to your dinner parties and has not been invited back since because of his inappropriate behavior and wasteful conduct. Therefore, you will not tolerate anyone's disrespect and offensive comments, especially when they do not have all of the facts to properly understand the situation to support a side.
Support our channel by joining as a member today, and we'll give you a shout out in our next video.
Or come watch this video next. You won't believe what Karen does in that one.